We have quite a panel, an evening in store for you. But first, let me tell you, we are pleased and proud to be co-sponsoring tonight's event. And we are so thrilled to have the Lens as our partner here at the School of Mass Communication. We are particularly proud to have our graduate, our award-winning graduate, Bob Marshall, here back home. And now our co-sponsors for the event from WWNO. Eve.
Hi, thanks everyone for being here. I'm Eve Troe. I am the still new, I think I'm still new, news director at WWNO, the first in the station's history.
Yay, we need that.
Oh, thank you. Well, I hope I deserve that applause in the long term. We're very happy to have had Last Call, the series, on our air. How many people got a chance to listen to Bob's work? Great. And we promoted it on the air as well, which is also maybe why some of you are here tonight. Bob worked with one of our producers, Fred Caston, to do some great audio storytelling. We're hoping to do much more of that. We have an official partnership with the Lens through the Knight Foundation that we're making bigger and better every day. And we're also always open to suggestions for our news coverage. So I'm going to ask another insidious question. How many of you are members of WWNO? Oh, great. Those of you with hands raised, if you're listening, I'm not going to say you should feel guilty, but consider it. And without any further ado, I'll introduce Bob Marshall, our wonderful award-winning hometown boy, who will talk about coastal erosion with our experts this evening. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Eve, and thank everyone for being here. This is really quite an amazing turnout. You know, the mission of the Lens, one of our missions is to do journalism on subjects of public interest. And obviously, this subject has some public interest. So thank you. A round of applause to you folks for turning out tonight, which for what I think is really the transcending issue for this area going forward, if you can believe most of the science. So our panel tonight, we're going to be talking about coastal erosion and the future of Louisiana's coast, the southeast coast in particular. And I'm going to let our panelists introduce themselves, starting with
Ann Rolfus. I am founding director of the Louisiana Bucket Brigade based here in New Orleans.
John Barry. I'm a member of the, it's not, well.
Oh, no, it might not be up enough.
It is on? Okay. I'm John Barry. I'm a member of the Southeast Louisiana Flood Protection Authority East, which is a body which the board for the levee districts in the east bank of the river, Metro New Orleans. And we have a seat on the Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority. I occupy that seat. And I'm also, as I guess in this audience you probably know, the author of Rising Tide.
Hello, everyone. Oh, Michael. You're on. Yes, you're on. Okay, good. Hello, everyone. It's so good to see so many people here. I'm Gary St. Pé. I'm the director of the Barrier Terrebonne National Estuary Program. Say that 10 times. We're one of 28 national estuary programs that was formed to develop restoration and an agreement among the people that live here and work here and play here. So that's what we did. And our plan was approved in 1996.
Great. I'm Aaron Viles. I'm the Deputy Director of the Gulf Restoration Network, an environmental advocacy organization based here in New Orleans, but we work Gulf-wide with board members and member organizations in all 5 Gulf states. And our mission is to unite and empower people to protect and restore the natural resources of the Gulf of Mexico.
Had I known that I had to sit in a director's chair, I would have insisted that the little thing for the cocktails be here. But, my name is David Muth. I am director for Mississippi River Delta Restoration for the National Wildlife Federation, and I'm part of a group of of non-governmental organizations, as we say, that is working toward delta restoration. 3 national organizations, Environmental Defense, National Audubon, National Wildlife Federation, and here in Louisiana, Lake Pontchartrain Basin Foundation, and the Coalition to Restore Coastal Louisiana.
Okay, our format tonight is pretty simple. I'll start off asking our panelists one question. They'll each answer the first one for about 5 minutes, and we'll just take it from there. It'll be pretty free-flowing, if I can say that properly. And at the end, we hope to have about 15 or 20 minutes for questions from the audience. So the question is, from me to you guys, is that during the series that Fred and I did for WWNO, we talked to probably 15 or 20 scientists, including some administrators of the programs that are trying to solve our coastal issues. The consensus among them was that if we don't have the master plan actually working and completing its mission over the next 40 to 50 years, most of southeast Louisiana will be underwater before the end of the century. So my question is, do you agree with that, and why? We'll start with Ann.
All right. Well, thanks. And what's important about the master plan is something that often comes up in conversations, or a dynamic that often comes up in conversations, which is that what is not said can be as important as what is said. And in the case of the master plan, what is not said is a real conversation about the oil industry's contribution to wetland loss, including what some mitigation measures ought to be happening right now. And I'm going to let the people who are experts on coastal erosion get into the details on that. And what I'm going to talk about is what should be asked of the oil industry, because again, the master plan asks really nothing of the oil industry, and in fact subsidizes it to a great degree. One of the points that Bob made in his series is the funding for this master plan, that is a big issue, that there is no money. It's $50 billion, and I believe Congress has appropriated $1 million for it so far. So there's no money for the master plan. Shell made $25 billion last year. BP made $25 billion last year. Chevron made $26 billion last year, and ExxonMobil made $49.9 billion last year. If you listen to Bob's story, you learned that 30 to 90% of the wetland loss is due to oil and gas activity. With all of that oil industry profit, I think there is plenty of money for the master plan. And yet nobody has asked a penny from them for it. And if you bring the question up, what Garrett Graves, the head of the Coastal Authority, will say is, let's not look backward. Let's not point fingers. In fact, the exact words are, let's not point fingers. And if you trace that statement, it comes from the oil industry itself. The oil industry says, let's not point fingers. But I don't think that asking the oil industry to pay for its damage is really pointing fingers. I think it's really forward thinking and really a practical solution to a big problem that we have. So the first solution would be getting them to cough up some money for the problems that they caused. The second problem, or the second solution, is to acknowledge the accidents. And I presume you're going to give me some wet flags on time.
Sure.
Right, okay. Is to acknowledge the accident problem. That this coastal restoration that everybody is working so hard to achieve really requires that we get a handle on these oil industry accidents. And just to give you an idea of the way that the master plan talks about the accident problem, on page 18, they talk about the largest disaster, environmental disaster in U.S. history, and say that for a healthy, resilient coastal ecosystem, we have to be able to cope with these kinds of unforeseen catastrophes, as if we don't know that oil industry accidents are coming. Well, Aaron and I met, 2 months before the BP disaster, and we talked about what were we going to do, 2 small nonprofit organizations, going to do about all the accidents in the Gulf. To paint a portrait for you, 3,000 accidents a year, right? They have a terrible problem with accidents, and yet they don't acknowledge it. One of the ongoing problems is a 15-mile oil slick in the Gulf that you can see from space. It's a leaking well that belongs to Taylor Energy. It has been leaking since 2004, all right? We have an ongoing epidemic of oil industry accidents in the Gulf. Those need to be corrected for a healthy coast. Number 3, they need to improve their infrastructure. things are rusting out there, they've got a real problem. Number 4, I think we have to acknowledge, and the master plan doesn't do this, but again, maybe we can get an addendum on there, or those of us in the room can put some pressure on our state to start to pivot away from fossil fuels. That's at the heart of this, that we're dedicated to a dead-end economy as long as it's dependent on fossil fuels. And number 5 is that we have to be able to talk about the oil industry. The oil industry did a really great job of sanitizing the master plan, of getting themselves out of it. There's one acknowledgement, one line, acknowledging that they are responsible for wetland loss, but again, it then doesn't ask anything of the industry. We have got to be able to talk about the fact that it is uncomfortable that they fund Jazz Fest and that they fund the Children's Museum and the aquarium and the zoo, things that we all enjoy, and yet that money shouldn't.
About America's wetlands.
Yeah. Well, I didn't have time for that one, so I'll let you handle that. And yet they shouldn't be able to buy our silence. The final comment I want to make on that is that the Greater New Orleans Foundation is done the wonderful thing of sponsoring this series, and we really appreciate it. What's interesting is that they also gave an award just last night to Phyllis Taylor, CEO of Taylor Energy, who has that 15-mile oil slick in the Gulf and an ongoing spill, right, since 2004. I don't say that to be obnoxious. The Dalai Lama was just here. I honestly say it in loving kindness, that we need to address these complexities, that we cannot expect the rest of the country to fork over any of their hard-earned money until we are willing to honestly address the industry in our own state. That's it. Thanks.
Thank you. John Barry.
Okay, first, the answer is yes, I agree. With the master plan is the last best chance for South Louisiana, if not mankind. I think well, it's not for mankind, but mankind has a lot of other problems besides South Louisiana. For us, I think the question is, will it actually work? And then if I have time, I'll add some comments about what Ann just said. There are 4 parts to answer the question whether it can work. First, do we have the technological ability to make it work? Second, do we have the sediment to make it work? Third, do we have the money to make it work? And fourth, do we have the political will to make it work? Regarding the technological expertise, we probably do. The answer to that is probably yes. Or it's also certainly improving. Even with existing technologies, it could probably be done. Hopefully those technologies will improve to make things work better and cheaper. And money is a big factor. Do we have enough sediment? In this room, you're probably aware the Mississippi River made all the land from Cape Girardeau, Missouri to the Gulf of Mexico. And then coastal currents carried sediment west, basically to the Texas state line, and made a lot of western Louisiana, coastal Louisiana, even though it's outside the Mississippi River floodplain. That's a lot of sediment. And the answer to that question is we don't know if we have enough sediment. Partly that depends on how much we need. And it's not entirely clear exactly how much we need, how efficiently we can use what's in the river, where we get it from, and so forth. But that's an answer where at least we have a fighting chance. Third, do we have enough money? And we're not getting any money from the federal government, that's clear. If I have gone around for the last 3 years saying that there's not a silver lining to the BP spill, it's a diamond-encrusted platinum lining. Because if it were not for the BP spill, we wouldn't have any dollars coming. And in this fiscal climate, there's just no chance of getting anything from the federal government. So as terrible as the spill was, it's the only place we're getting money anytime soon. And there certainly should be enough money from BP to at least start the system rolling. In 2017, we started collecting revenues from the Outer Continental Shelf, but that is that's a limit. There's thanks to the New Mexico senator, we have a cap of $500 million for the entire Gulf that comes out of those revenues, of which we probably get about half. So $250 million a year, it's a lot of money, but it's not enough to solve the problem. Finally, do we have the political will? And I routinely have said when I go around speaking that as difficult as the engineering is, the politics are more complicated. That we have not yet really, only right now are we beginning to address some of the political questions. When we start telling people that they are outside any plans to protect them, that's a problem. You know, the master plan twice, in 2007 it was basically conceptual, passed the legislature unanimously. Last year it again passed the legislature unanimously. I was a little bit surprised it did, frankly. The next time around, it's not going to pass the legislature unanimously. We already have fights over diversions, which are just beginning to come to the surface. And I mean, resolving these, it's tough. So it's not just the fights in Washington, it's fights internally in the state. When we start to spend state money that doesn't come from the BP spill, then you're going to have North Louisiana and places outside the Rhonda. Okay. So finally, just to comment on what Ann was saying, I certainly agree the oil industry needs to be held accountable. I mentioned America's Wetlands to her, which has been to a certain extent funded by Shell. All they ever talk about, they go around the country, they make presentations, it's the levees. Look, the levees are part of the problem, but they are not by any stretch the whole problem.
Thank you, John. Carrie St. Pay.
Oh yeah, John wanted me to mention that my first cousin was Rene Fauché, and he coached them in the
The Tulane team that beat LSU 14-0.
That was historic.
There's no question that that we need restoration of our coast. The land loss issue is affecting everything, things that you might not even imagine. You know, I've lived here all my life, and I've seen the real impact. And I worked here for 25 years in water pollution control, and I've seen water intakes be too salty to drink. That's only a recent development. Excuse me. We have farmers as high in the Barataria Basin as Donaldsonville and Napoleonville come to us and telling us, you know, there's something happening. There's something blocking the rainwater from coming up. It's even, we have the water rising even when it's not rained. These canals, these drainage canals need to be dredged. And I point out to them, I say, listen to what you're saying. You're saying it's not raining and the water's coming up. What's happening is as these land masses disappear to the south, the tidal system in Louisiana is wind dominated. The winds blow the water in, and they raise the water levels, and the only way it can be released from the upper Barataria system is through bidesalments. So all that water is stacked up against bidesalments, flowing into bidesalments, and impacting our agricultural industry. Our fisheries industries are impacted. Everything is being impacted. And more importantly, most importantly, the ability of the marshes to mitigate or to ameliorate storm surges has disappeared. You know, for years and years, we all endured hurricanes here. And nowadays, we got very minimal storms, unnamed storms, just periods of predominant southerly winds, stacking up water in our system to where it's flooding streets. And I'm fond of pointing out to people that most of the people that live in the Barataria-Tamil National Estuary have their ancestors, their first ancestor that came here generations ago. That's a very unique characteristic. That's why we all enjoy, that's why we all have this culture we have. My own ancestors came here in 1760. And in 1806, I think, when we had our last French governor. That French governor toured the countryside, and he encountered a guy named Pierre Saint-Pé. He was one of my ancestors. And he wrote about him and talked about him in his memoirs. And he was preparing for the floods. You know, we lived with the floods back then. Nowadays, and he had hurricanes, by the way. He had hurricanes, but there were no levees. We didn't need levees because we had all these land masses. We had continuous marshes all the way to the coast. And over the years, we've had to build levees and higher levees and more protection levees just to protect us from the water coming in. And John's right. Those levees are part of the problem, but we have no choice. To keep the communities the way they are, we have to protect ourselves from flooding. So that brings me to the master plan and your question. I was getting around to it. Yeah, we support the master plan. But there are projects in the master plan that are counter to the estuary program's CCNP. And those deal with the massive water diversions. You know, the plan that we developed over a 5-year period is very protective of our culture. Cultural importance and cultural protection is important in the estuary program. So we don't want to do things that will destroy that culture. We don't want to put so much water in the basin to where storm surges, it's just enough water in the basin that storm surges put that water over the levees. We don't want to flood people. So yes, we do support the master plan, and using the adaptive management, we feel that these massive diversions won't even get off the ground because the people won't want it. So thank you.
Thank you, Kerry. Aaron Viles.
What's the question again? It's been a while. So do I support the master plan? Do we think the fundamental...
Do you think it will... is that our only chance to save Southeast Louisiana, and why?
Yeah, I think it's the best chance. I think, is South Louisiana going to exist as we know it if we use the master plan? No. This is a very dynamic system. It has changed for centuries. It is going to continue to change. And there's a popular idea out there that we can restore the coast, we can save the coast, we can save our way of life. We can continue to adapt to this coast. It is going to always be dynamic. And the forces at work are changing. The river doesn't have as much sediment as it once did. We can't, build a new spit of land to reach to, the equivalent of Cape Girardeau in the other direction. It's just not possible. We've got accelerated sea level rise, Climate change is not the Easter Bunny. You don't get to pick whether or not it exists, and it doesn't really matter which one you pick. It's real, it's happening. The scientists have made it very clear it's happening, it's our fault, and we have to deal with it. What does that bring us? That brings us stronger storms. It brings us rising seas, and it puts our coast really just in the bullseye. So I think the master plan is our best shot. I certainly don't think it's going to guarantee that we're going to be able to exist the way we've always existed here. I wouldn't use John's terms. I think the BP disaster is certainly an opportunity. And I think there are funding revenue streams that we should be able to utilize that no one would have expected 4 years ago. But I think also, just as our politicians have an incredible capacity to ignore science in terms of climate change, they also have I think, a really good capacity to ignore science in terms of coastal land law. So I think right now in Louisiana, there's very clear political will to use the BP revenues to jumpstart our master plan. I think there's a lot of infighting. The Restore Act, which we supported and worked hard to pass, if you're not familiar with it, it directs 80% of BP's eventual Clean Water Act fines to fund Gulf recovery, not Gulf restoration, not Louisiana's master plan, Gulf recovery, which is, that word is a loss, because it's broader than ecosystem restoration. So we've already seen the proclivity for parochial politics to direct what should be ecosystem restoration dollars to less worthy projects. We've got a plan for a beachfront hotel and conference center that the state of Alabama thinks will address some of their BP impacts that's on the books now. That's what they want to use the bulk of their $100 million in early restoration dollars for. That's outrageous. I don't think, Louisiana is different than Alabama. We've got a lot, I think if Alabama had this meeting, I don't think so many folks would show up. We're further ahead in terms of understanding the vulnerability of our communities and the need for coastal restoration. But I think that any dollar that's spent through NERDA or through the BP Restore funded initiatives, any dollar that does not go to making our communities and our ecosystems and the industries that rely on those more resilient, that should be a crime. Unfortunately, the law does not make it a crime. The law allows it. It's going to be a free-for-all to try to get those dollars directed towards useful things. So I am hopeful that the master plan will continue to have political will behind it, and that it will continue to be a priority of this state, and that it will be implemented in ways that are sensitive to the community and acknowledge uncertainty and bring communities in to help craft the implementation strategy. But I'm certainly not going to guarantee that. What I do think is that we are all going to need to work really hard. That master plan does not actually start building land for 30 years net. It's a 50-year plan. It's a $50 billion plan, and it takes 30 years to really start building land. So we have put ourselves in quite a position, and we need to work very hard as a community to advance that ball.
Thank you, Aaron. Now it's David Muth's turn.
Well, I came prepared to talk about the 2012 master plan, but since we're now in 2017, that's a joke. But that's an important point to make. That the master plan is not just a document that's sitting on a shelf somewhere. It's actually a process that the state set up. And it's a process that requires, by statute, revision every 5 years. The 2012 plan is the second plan, based on the 2007 plan, and there will be another plan in 2017, building on what's been done. So the answer is that the master plan process is literally the only hope for there to be any part of coastal Louisiana left in 50 years. And I say that with full conviction. There may be other processes that we could use. There may be other plans that could be written, but we've run out of time, and we've run out of. Why not?
There you go.
We're out of time, and we now have a blueprint that we can begin to use I don't know why every other word is going to the mic, but I'll hold my head down.
The words we don't like, we're taking out. It's called editing.
If I can get this thing
darn, he's going to fix it.
I shouldn't have fixed it.
Use this.
Here, I got it. I got it, Kerry.
Watch it. Don't take anything from that man.
Yeah. Wait a minute. Where was I? Oh, so the master plan. Yeah, so, you know, we've heard a lot of discussion here, and a great deal of it is something that I completely agree with. And I just want to build on a few of the ideas that have been put out there. So the process that was put in place was to take the best science, the best engineering, the best forecasting using a series of models that had been developed by teams of scientists, not just local experts on the Louisiana coast, but scientists who were experts on the processes that they were using to integrate those models and to begin the work to figure out what could be done. As Aaron said, there's no way to hold the line. We lost. We lost 300 years ago when we decided that we could levee the river and we could start closing distributary channels. There were marshes in the Barataria Basin and the Terrebonne Basin all the way to the Gulf. And the reason that there were marshes is because that was an actively building part of the delta. That's the part of the process that we decided a long time ago we couldn't put up with. All of coastal Louisiana was always a place where the river was winning in some places and the Gulf was winning in other places. We changed the odds. We built levees, we closed distributaries, we deepened the passes so that big ships could come in and out, and we took what had been a system in balance with growth in some places and loss in others, and we took it way out of balance. And we got really, really good at that. And in the 20th century, in order for all of us to enjoy cheap oil and gas, we let the oil companies run roughshod and dredge 10,000 miles of canals. This is all true. It all happened. It's all there. We can't turn the clock back. What we can do is pay very close attention to how we got here in the first place. And we got here because the Mississippi River builds land. Dredges can build some land. Drainage projects can build some land. But the way we got here, the way everything from Cairo to the Gulf got here, was the Mississippi River building land. We are convinced, based on the science, based on the history, that that's the only path forward. The master plan is going to use about half the flow of the Mississippi River in flood to start building land again. John pointed out that there's less sediment in the river now than there used to be. But I want to caution that we don't really know how much less sediment. Those measurements are based upon a period when we had cut down all the forests in the east, we had broken the sod throughout the entire Great Plains, we were logging the Rocky Mountains, and the river was full of sediment. We don't really know what the baseline is. We know that we're at 40 to 50% of what was in there then, but we need to now figure out what we do. And I want to turn the question around. Not is there enough sediment in the river, but why wouldn't you use every bit of it available to build something back in the place of what we've lost? And that's what we're advocating for. That's what the master plan proposes. Between now and the next iteration, we need to figure out how to capture that other 50%. And to do that, we need a new navigation channel. We need a new way to get ships in and out of the river so that we can use every capability that the river has to build land. And we have to do everything else. There's $20 billion worth of marsh creation in the master plan. We need to do that. We need to do the Barrier Island projects. But we need to let the river start doing its work.
Thank you. Thank you, panelists. Well, let me go right back to David Muth with this question, since this is really the kind of the hottest topic right now. The master plan says that the best way to build the most economical way and the most efficient way to build land over a long period of time or in perpetuity is with large sediment diversions in the river. What do you tell people who will see their lives, their traditional lives ended? They'll have to move because the system's going back to fresh water. What do you tell them when you say, we're building a diversion here, and they say, can't we do this some other way? I'll start with David on that.
Well, thank you for that question, Bob. That's very generous of you. There is no simple answer. I think that the most brutal answer is we're all moving if we don't rebuild the coast. And I mean all of us. We can't sustain, even our $15 billion levee system around the greater New Orleans area is unsustainable without some buffer between it and the sea. The generosity of the American people after Katrina to send $15 billion to us to build out that system is not likely to repeat itself. We are now in competition with everyone else in the country. We're seeing it with what happened on the East Coast. The seas are rising. So the alternative is not, can I go on doing what I'm doing? Because nobody's going to be able to go on doing what they're doing. So what we have to do is figure out how we transition people who are going to be affected by diversions. I am convinced that a lot of the fear about what they're going to do is not realistic. In fact, that things are not going to be as bad as some folks claim. But I absolutely am certain that transitions will have to take place and that we as a society are responsible for helping people through those transitions. And my organization, my campaign, we're devoted to trying to do that.
Okay, let me ask Carrie St. Pé, is there another way to do this other than large diversions? Can we mine sediment and use slurry pipelines efficiently and cost-effectively to rebuild all this land that the planners say can only be done with large-scale diversions?
Well, I think that's the only, functional answer. That's all we can do. Am I on?
Yeah. Yes. Use this. Use this.
The estuary program believes that at all costs we need to be concerned with the people that live here. And it's true, the river built this place over 7,000 years at a time when it had a lot of sediments, and those sediments are no longer in the river. And when the river built this place, there's one characteristic that we seem to keep forgetting. There were no people here. There were, some Native Americans that migrated in here and migrated out when it flooded. So you're not affecting people. You can let the river go all you want, and that's a great thing. Now, there's people living here. There's people making their livings here, making their living off the water, and we feel very strongly that the probability of being flooded is very real with these massive diversions. And we think there is a way to do it. I want to tell you that there is hope. And the master plan contains a lot of mined sediment and using to rebuild the coastal landscape. And we love to see that. That's great. That strategy, that mining of sediment and using it for restoration purposes has been examined. It's been examined in a 1999 report costing $1 million to the state of Louisiana. The state funded that project. And it concluded that we could restore 400 square miles of wetlands using mined sediment, 400 square miles in 50 years. No major diversion is going to restore land in that way. Now, people were fond of telling me, yeah, but Carrie, man, that's expensive. Yes, it's expensive. But look what you're getting. You're getting protection for your communities right away. As soon as you build a landmass, you're not protecting everybody because it's taking you 50 years to rebuild it.
but you gain it. You gain it. You're walking on the restoration technique. You're not doing that with a diversion. Diversions are important, but they are protective strategies. They can sustain the marshes we would build. And people say, well, that's expensive. It's expensive because of the cost of fuel. Well, you know, I think that argument is very weak. You know, I can't believe that we're going to stop everything that's funded, that's operated with an internal combustion engine that's important in the future because fuel's increasing. And the dredging can be done with natural gas, with you know, electricity. It's done all over the world. Why don't we focus on that? And why don't we focus on that technique and, you know, really look at it and how can we reduce the cost? Because it is expensive. But even at the expense, by the way, it costs $634 million a year to fund that with 3 dredges in the Mississippi River, 2 in the Atchafalaya, and several offshore. So it is expensive, but it's still cheaper to restore it.
Next question is, the oil industry was brought up, the energy industry, by several of our panelists. So the question arises, and it was asked of me, and I asked everyone really that Fred and I interviewed for the series, and that is, why not make the oil companies pay more? Why hasn't the state sued the oil companies? We, in fact, interviewed a fellow with Mid-Continent Oil and Gas, that's the main lobbyist for the oil industry here. If you heard that report, I think it was Thursday. And he said that they felt like they've done enough, you know, for the state. Let me ask our panelists, why doesn't the state, or why don't individuals, is there any profit in suing the oil industry, or how would you make them contribute more, other than the royalties they already pay to the federal government for offshore oil and gas royalties? We'll start here with
my favorite question. Well, as far as the mechanism, I don't think that's very hard if there's the will. So you could mandate that they contribute $1 billion each, or, you know, every year. So
just a blank check.
Yeah, just make them do it. But the question, of course, the more complicated question is, you know, why, if it's that easy, why don't we do it? And actually, I heard you address this question once, and I think it's really true. And it's because the voters really don't demand it. And the dynamic that we have now is a very long history, you know, starting in the 20s, of the oil industry very smartly insinuating themselves not just into our economy, but into our culture. So we think it's shrimp, white boots, and the oil industry. We see it, you know, and our swamp, as if the swamp would not exist without the oil industry, and in fact, that's not true. But because it's so integrated with our culture, you know, that lays a very, very deep foundation. So if you try to go to the next question, okay, economy. You know, why can't we tax these oil, you know, I said that horrible T word. Why can't we tax these oil companies and make them pay for the master plan? Of course, that's political. The politicians are in the habit now of defending the oil industry, and it's very interesting now when you see the oil industry questioned, you actually don't see their own representatives defending them, maybe the occasional Lamoga person, but really you see Senator Vitter, Senator Landrieu, Congressman Cassidy or Bustani. Those people are the oil industry's spokespeople. But to the greater question of, all right, so then what do we need to do to get around this? I think we just need to look honestly at the situation. So, for example, you know, in my work to get them to be accountable, it actually would be good for our economy if they would end their accidents, right? My second recommendation was to end the accidents, and the third was to improve their infrastructure. That is good for our economy, right? It involves hiring a lot more people in the oil industry to get out there and change these rusty pipes and plug the leaks and pull out these old wells. Better hurricane prep means a lot more equipment bought. So it's good for our economy in that you force them to buy equipment and you force them to hire people. You know, that's really common sense. And yet, because there is this, you know, 90-year history of the oil industry fomenting its really, at this point, false ideas we have this knee-jerk reaction that if you, we can't ask them to pay money, it would be bad for the industry. I mean, again, Exxon made $49 billion. It might cost their shareholders some money, but it certainly wouldn't be bad for the industry. It'd be great for Louisiana. So I think if we all start calling Vitter and Landrieu all the time, we could get it done.
Okay, John, is there a way to tax the oil industry?
Well, I mean, politically, it would be very difficult in this state. Historically, there was a period when the state was basically a wholly owned subsidiary of the oil and gas. Now, someone was just commenting to me today that now they only rent it.
It's a step before moving out.
Well, you know, and then you have the actual difficulties of defining a lawsuit. And you start thinking about that, and it's not easy. I mean, most of the land that was lost, the oil companies owned. You know, I mean, they're not going to sue themselves for the land loss if they own the land. But let me address something that Kerry said and regarding the diversions and marsh creation is the buzzword for building it physically and not using the river. And the master plan calls for $20 billion, which I guess is the single largest expenditure in the $50 billion plan for marsh creation to build 200 square miles of land. And it has diversions building 300 square miles for roughly $4 billion, less than $4 billion. So I am entirely supportive of the idea of maintaining the way of life, which has made Louisiana Louisiana. There's not a lot of purpose in destroying the village to save it, to use the Vietnam line. But at some point, we have to figure out what we can afford to do. And if we were to get the money, yes, I'm totally in favor of that. If there's some other way, I mean, the master plan is iterative for a reason because of the so-called adaptive management that's built into it, meaning as we learn something, we know we're going to make mistakes, but we're you know, committed not to start down a path and stay on it just because we started down the path. At least in theory we are, and hopefully once we actually start moving forward on it, we'll make adjustments as we learn stuff. If we can bring down the cost of using slurry pipelines and things like that, then we will move in a different direction. But the reality is that the money is limited. And that's something that has to be on everybody's mind. And that, again, is when what I said earlier, when I said the politics of this stuff is harder than the engineering. And if we could get some money from the oil industry, the oil and gas, obviously that's a huge potential source of funds. It still won't solve all the problems. We still have questions about the sediment. We still have whether there's enough, even if we had unlimited funds. Part of that depends on how much sea level really does rise and how much sediment we need and other factors. But money is a big part of the problem. And as David said, the answer to some people, and hopefully not where Kerry lives, is if we don't go forward with this stuff, everybody's going to have to move. It is not, I mean, we're facing a desperate situation, make no mistake.
Thank you, John. Kerry St. Pei, you've already talked about the other way, diversions. The oil industry was part of your life for a long time. Maybe you can tell us how difficult it is to get the polluters in this state to actually pay for their damage. Does the state do a decent, or let me back up, does the state do a good job in enforcing the regulations on the book?
Thanks for that question.
Tell me your background.
Well, since 1974, I worked for water pollution control, and in the heart of the Barry Terry Terrebonne National Estuary, I guess. But I inspected oil fields. And I responded to oil field complaints. I've covered thousands of oil spills, and I saw some real damage. I mean, when the land loss issues started coming up, you know, people were talking about the evils of saltwater intrusion affecting freshwater vegetation and killing vegetation. At a time when I was looking at oil field brine discharges directly into marshes, you know, and you could point to that person is killing acres and acres and acres of marsh. So, you know, I'm well aware of the impacts of the oil and gas industry. Several things. You know, I'm also aware that the state has given them the permits to dredge canals, and the federal government has given them permits. They've done all this with permits, even discharging oil field brine. It's a regulation. You can't discharge oil field brine. I'm talking about salinities in an order of 150 parts per thousand. And by the way, it's not just brine, not just salt water. There's radium-226 in it. And it wasn't, these discharges were not stopped till I did a study, a major study of oil field brine discharges during the Romer administration, which he was very, you know, pro-environment. And that was the only time when I could have done such a study. And the regulations were changed, and they phased out those discharges, and they no longer discharge anymore. But at the time the estuary program was getting started in 1992, I co-authored a paper with Nancy Rabelais, and we totaled the amount of brine, oil field brine discharge in our estuaries. It was 89 million gallons per day. Per day. Those discharges were going on until 2000, the year 2000. I'm not talking about back in the 50s. You know, that's the kind of, you know, that's the thing we're dealing with. The political hold is very strong. But at the same time, you know, the agencies and the state of Louisiana, the federal government, gave them permits to do all this. And so, you know, I don't think we'll gain anything by going to the industry and telling them, you know, you messed up and all of this, and you need to be paying up. But I think we might succeed in going to them and say, look, you know, we gave you the permits, you did what we told you you could do, but things have changed. We're all going to suffer. Your pipelines are being exposed. Your infrastructure is being wiped out with storm surges because it's not being you know, ameliorated with ridges and barrier islands and marshes. So, and we can't afford to do this alone, and you need to help us. And I think we might succeed in getting some money for restoration in that way.
Thank you.
Most of those permits did include language, if not all the permits, saying that they were supposed to restore the stuff.
But they weren't enforced.
Well, they weren't enforced, but they're still in the language.
Louisiana actually has very good regulations. We have very good regulations. We don't enforce them. A regulation is only good, you know, if you enforce it. If it's just you know, on paper, well, it's we can all point to, oh, we got a good regulation here, but you got to enforce it.
Yeah. I mean,
Well, but
that raises another problem with the lawsuit is prescription. You have a time limit during which you can file a lawsuit, and pretty much that's a tough hurdle to get over. So.
And I'm not talking about enforcing. I'm sorry, Bob. Okay. I'm not talking about enforcing just loosely and very, even strongly. I'm a very moderate person, but I'm talking about enforcing, against the most egregious violations, that's the people you need to, make an example of. But that never happened.
Aaron Viles, that question and another one, maybe we'll start switching the topic here, and that is, how do you get local people involved in this? It seemed to everyone we interviewed for this series, for Fred, the series that Fred and I did for WWNO, we asked them, do people in Louisiana understand, especially Southeast Louisiana, understand just how serious the situation is, just what peril they live in? And they said, well, I think they're more aware now, but they're not really invested in this issue. I mean, the city government here in New Orleans, you never hear about them talking about this. So let me ask you that question if I can. How do you get people to understand that this part of the state, the place where they might want their children and grandchildren to live, will be underwater by the time those descendants reach the age maybe to go to college or buy a house?
Well, we pride ourselves on being a group that prioritizes outreach and talking to the public and getting the public engaged. So, we're actually right now, we've got folks out knocking on doors to tell them about what's going on with our coast, with the BP disaster and the continuing impacts of that, and urging people to get engaged. So I think old school technology can sometimes do wonders. We do interrupt a lot of dinners, and I apologize for that. But I think it's really important that people understand this should be a kitchen table issue for everyone. Shouldn't just be the folks on this panel or half the folks in this room that really think passionately about this and are considering it frequently. We've partnered with a group called South Wings an awful lot. We have found it really effective to fly over the marsh and see what's going on with your own eyes. When you see a GPS map that shows all land, and then you look down and it's all water because the map is a couple decades old. I think that hits home, certainly. How many folks here have ever been to a CPRA meeting? Yeah. How many folks who don't know what CPRA means? About half and half. That's good. I mean, I think it's really critical that people get a bit more engaged in the different decision-making bodies. So, we should be constantly buttonholing John and say, here's something we think is really important. If you're really opposed to diversions, say, you should be making sure that your voice is being heard. If you think the oil industry should be held to greater account, then you should make sure your voice is being heard. And there are places you can do that. I mean, I think it is outrageous. Is this being live broadcast or anything? What is it? Where's this going?
Cowboy up here, man.
I think it's outrageous that we keep electing somebody like Steve Scalise to represent us. I really do. The guy who fights back on the reality of climate change, the guy who carries water for the oil industry at every opportunity. Like, we are not Nigeria, people. We are not 80% of our GDP directly tied to the oil industry. Maybe 80% of the political GDP is tied to the oil industry, but not the real world. The real world that lives here is far more dependent on our wetlands than we are on the oil industry. And that's a false choice. It's not one or the other. But yeah, who needs to man up? It's the oil industry, and they need to come and start spending some money. The only reason they'll do that, though, I don't think that the ask nicely approach is going to work. I think the America's Wetlands Foundation gave them lots of opportunities to understand the problem and understand the severity and spend some money, and they did. They spent some money so the America's Wetlands Foundation can take a bunch of people to Vietnam right now, I think. Is that where they are? So good. I'm glad we'll understand the global ramifications of delta land loss, and that's important, certainly. But I also think it's important that we fund this project. The $50 billion master plan is ambitious. There's also maps in there that show the $100 billion plan. And that's even more ambitious, and that gives us a lot more of a buffer between us and the Gulf of Mexico. So I think it's up to you guys. I'm working my ass off here. I think you guys need to step up and help out and make sure the oil industry is asked, politely, sure, if you want to be polite. Or I think you really are, which is fantastic. But I think There are other ways too, and I think legally there are some handles that haven't been tried. I think
Such
actually,
as?
yeah,
What are the handles that haven't been tried?
You know, the statute of limitations is a good consideration, but yeah, these were permitted activities, and so the state didn't actually enforce those permits. So maybe we don't maybe we don't sue the oil industry. Maybe we sue the state. But the state certainly has a lot of opportunities to talk to the oil industry. But I don't know. We sent a very polite-ish letter to Shell in, I don't know, 2009. There was like 40 different organizations from Greenpeace to the Shrimp Association. We sent it to Shell saying, we've done some simple back of the kind of envelope math about how much of the wetlands you destroyed and how much it costs to fix them, and here's what we think you should pay to the state's trust fund, Coastal Restoration Trust Fund. We didn't expect them to write a check. We were hoping for some sort of engagement on the issue. They sent us back a thank you for applying to the Shell Foundation. Your proposal does not fit within our funding guidelines this year. Please consider applying again in the future.
All right. So we'll go on to David Muth. What is, how do you get people involved or engaged, or do you think they're already engaged, involved enough? Can this process move along, no matter which technique we decide to use, whether it's diversions or slurry pipelines? We have to do something. Is there enough push from the people in this city, in this part of the state, to get this done? Are they aware of what's happening?
Well, first of all, I want to say that, like Aaron, I'm bitter that the America's Wetland Foundation didn't invite me to Vietnam either.
Did that come across?
But they didn't. So so the question I think has several levels. One is, you know, if you look at the whatever it is, nearly 3 million people that live in coastal Louisiana or within 20 miles or so, I think, you know, if you ask anyone who lives in Lafitte or Dulac or Morgan City, they're 100% aware of this issue, and they're concerned, and they're deeply involved one way or the other. When you get to New Orleans, then that awareness begins to go down. We live behind levees. We got a big reminder, all of us living within those levees in 2005, and that really changed the equation, and it changed the level of awareness of citizens in a place like New Orleans. But you know, now there's a new levee system, and I think that the complacency is returning again. I think the
don't know what's going on. The CPRA meeting, the most south they went was Bell Chase.
There's time for questions.
I have no questions. No, I think the dust off my feet.
Sorry.
But I think, you know, the fact that the legislature has twice adopted the master plan. We did polling before the master plan, and there was, you know, 80 to 90% support statewide from every demographic for adoption of the master plan. I think there is widespread awareness. But I also think that what we have to understand is that we have another issue, and that's this question of funding and how we get the funding. And that involves national awareness. And part of what we do, part of what my partners and I work on, is building this national awareness. We've seen it grow quite dramatically since Katrina, and especially since BP. You know, when you ask Americans what are our most important wetlands, 10 years ago they all would have said the Everglades, the Okefenokee, maybe the Chesapeake. I think we're now on the radar. I think people understand the importance of this place and that understanding is growing all the time. That's part of our job, is to bring that awareness nationwide, and we work on that. We work on it with sportsmen. We work on it with people who are naturally inclined to care about wildlife and so forth. But it's an uphill battle. There are a lot of things out there grabbing people's attention, and we just have to keep working at it.
All right, last question for our panel here before we turn it open to questions, and that is, starting here with Ann, what can the people, give me one thing the people in this room can do to help prevent the coast from going under?
So my concern or goal would be to get the funding, and I think the best funding comes from the oil industry. And so to start to email and make telephone calls to your congressional delegation and to our senators about that.
John?
Well, I'd say, I mean, Dalai Lama was here the other, and there was a statement in the paper, if you think you're small, try sleeping with a mosquito. If you think you're too small to make a difference, I should say, try sleeping with a mosquito. Yeah, I mean, you need to be active. Now, incidentally, the CPRA is the Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority, which writes the master plan and which also is going to be the recipient of all the funding from BP and other sources. So they are the entity that deals with the coast. Yeah, politicians respond to what they hear, and they respond to donations. That's a simple fact. But given a choice between what they hear and donations, they're going to go with what they hear. Because those people are voters. The only reason they want the donations is to connect, is to get their message to the voters. If they're hearing from voters directly, that moves them more than a donation does. So, you know, this is an act, I mean, you're here, that you're already involved in the issue. Send some emails. Just tell them the issue's important to you. And don't forget the state legislature. I think they are as important, if not in some ways more important than the Congress. Because no matter what happens in the federal government, we're not getting any money from the feds in the foreseeable future. Deal with it. And as I think it was Aaron said, Alabama wants to spend its money on a convention center for the Restore Act. There's a bill in the legislature now that commits Louisiana's money to the CPRA and to coastal restoration. Stay on that stuff. It does matter.
Kerry?
My perception is that you want a short answer. Yeah.
My perception is you're not going to give me one, but go ahead. It's just,
That's very perceptive. We're asked this all the time. What can I do as an individual? And you know, I almost feel bad by telling people this, but it's true. You have to educate yourself. You have to accept the fact that there are things about, you know, the coastal situation and the coastal land loss and the ways to restore it, the techniques to restore it, that you may not be aware of. And so the first thing to do is to educate yourself. There's a number of organizations that produce a lot of stuff, a lot of educational material. We produced 8 videos, 8 documentaries. We give all our stuff away. We have teacher curricula. We've spent millions of dollars educating, producing all this stuff. So the first thing to do, if I have to give you one answer, is to educate yourself, not only on the problem, but on the restoration techniques. There's a lot of restoration techniques. There's 1,000 different ways to restore, or that people perceive can be done to restore Louisiana, but some can't be done for certain reasons, you know. So educate yourself, please.
that wasn't too long.
Let me add. I'll add just one little thing.
Okay.
There's all kind of places you can volunteer. You can do plantings, vegetative plantings, and that helps. But really, the things that need to be done are, the major projects that we really, as individuals, cannot do or cannot afford. But you can stop littering, or don't litter, or don't pour your oil down a drain, and you can volunteer for different groups to do vegetative plantings.
Thank you, and it's Aaron's turn. One thing.
One thing. So who's got the checkbook? We need $50 billion. If you could write the check today. I think, Ann nailed it. Like, get engaged. John underscored it. Like, get informed and get involved. We would love your support. All the groups up here, represented up here, plus lots of others are at the table working very hard to ensure that restoration is prioritized and the money doesn't go to conference centers and hotels. But it's amazing to me how much our politicians all agree that BP should pay the greatest fines possible under the law and those monies should stay in the Gulf. Only 1 in 100 oil spills in Louisiana ever gets a fine attached to it. But BP, for some reason, because everyone saw that oil spill, realized they should take advantage of it. So I think that our politicians need to bring that same level of determination to every instance where the oil industry is screwing up the coast. And the only way that will ever happen is if you guys help us to make it happen. So please, get engaged.
David Muth.
Well, obviously the fact that you all are in this room means that we don't even have to tell you what to do. You know what to do. The problem is not with the folks who show up at a forum like this or the folks who listen to your broadcast or who read the stories in the Lens. The problem is with people who are otherwise distracted, who aren't paying attention to these things. I'm always amazed when I see polls and issues like climate change and the fact that we're losing all of our coastal communities are way down on people's list of concerns. But until we make it very clear to the power brokers in this country, and that's both on the government side and the corporate side, that we're very concerned about the future for our children and grandchildren, about climate change and about the changes that are now beginning to overtake us, we're in big trouble. Louisiana is in the unique position of being the worst case scenario, right? And we got clobbered. The reason that the state of Louisiana is a leader, a world leader on dealing with adaptation and climate change and developing the master plan process is because of what happened to us with Katrina and Rita. And we're seeing that lesson being shared now with other people around the country, but the fact is that we have a long way to go, and everybody just has to stay active and engaged and talk to their neighbors and their relatives and hope for the best.
Okay. I would just add the same thing. Since you're here, you're engaged, and you really need to reach out to people who aren't in the choir. Talk to your neighbors, send emails, send stories to your relatives, especially if they live out of town. I think it is, as John says, these people here aren't that optimistic about getting federal help, but it doesn't hurt if those folks are emailing their congressmen and senators, regardless of which party they're in, saying, this issue is important to us as well. So questions from the audience. We have a mic that'll come to you.
And I guess we really should say our name. My name's Clint Guidry. I'm the president of Louisiana Shrimp Association. I did participate in the framework development team. Kind of belated, but I did sit on it. And I was in all the discussions formulating the master plan. There's a common thread that kind of ran through all these guys. Oil companies, money, cost, and politics. And some of the things I've seen sitting on the framework development team concern cost and concern politics. And I think if I had to make a recommendation, I would recommend that we take rebuilding our coast away from the politicians. And that way, maybe the money could be used more wisely and more cost efficient. Because what I'm seeing already is a lot of contracts being let for a lot of money based on a really high value that I know could be spent more wisely. We also are against the large diversions. The rate that we're losing Louisiana coast, I just don't see a diversion doing that. I think that's going to happen automatically. I think that we're going to get a storm, and you're going to have diversions everywhere if we don't start putting something out there and do it in the most cost-efficient way. Would anybody like to answer that question?
Where was the question?
I've learned the whole time.
I know, you stuck that in. We need questions. So we don't have enough time for statements. We're going to go over here now.
Over here?
Hi, my name is Joyce. In a couple weeks, I'm going to a luncheon, and Senator Landrieu is going to be there, and I'd like you to help me fashion the perfect question for her.
Who wants to take that?
Well, I'll just say, if she's reelected and if the Democrats retain the Senate, she will chair the Energy and Natural Resources Committee. It's a very powerful position.
I think ask her directly the question about what about the oil industry's ability to pay for the master plan, and maybe preempt her response, which would be no need to point fingers, and say nobody's pointing fingers, but it seems like a reasonable checking account to use. Yeah. Remember, Exxon made $49.9 billion.
Okay. I'm Philip Deloney. I'm a native and resident of New Orleans, and I want to ask a question about the reference to the 10,000 miles of canals that have been drilled. Isn't it true that many of these canals have served their purpose and they're essentially abandoned? If so, does anybody have a plan for filling them? I mean, it seems like that would be a big help. If the canals are causing all this erosion, why don't we just get rid of a bunch of them?
Well, yeah, we've dredged thousands of miles of canals, and most of those canals were in heavy produced areas, and there was a lot of oil sucked out of the earth, and it resulted in a collapse of the Earth's crust in those locations. So that's a lot of this is subsidence we've experienced, and a lot of the land loss. But there are some canals, not many, but some that are abandoned where they've removed the oil production platform. But the short answer is there's not enough sediment to build the marshes on the side of these canals, much less fill up, a 6-foot canal. Now, when David was in, I think he was still in the service, but the Park Service, he was involved with a project that did fill canals, and it worked pretty well. I don't know about the expense of it.
No, it was, we did, because part of the mission of the national parks is to restore things to as natural a condition as possible. We did do a lot of canal backfilling, probably more than any other landowner in the state. But the issue here is the scale of the problem. If you start looking at the projects in the master plan, whether they're marsh creation through pipeline sediment delivery, which proposes to build 200 square miles of land, they're going to be filling canals. Or whether you do massive sediment diversions, those sediment diversions are going to be filling canals. So it's going to happen. Now, should we have a program in this state that incentivizes landowners to backfill canals? Yes, it would be. I think it would be enormously helpful. The techniques are worked out. They're relatively inexpensive as a way to create marsh. But let's face it, when we talk about people not fulfilling the permit obligation, one of the reasons they didn't restore the canals is the landowners wanted the canals. And people fishing and using those canals wanted them to stay. And that's why we left most of them in place. Not because the oil company didn't fulfill the permit conditions, because the enforcers, the landowners and others, didn't want to mess with those canals. They were useful to people. And so we're going to have to live with those that are still there for the most part.
I do think that you could scale up some of the backfilling. Scott Eustace, who's our wetland specialist, looked pretty closely at a number of these different canals, especially just the ones that are in wildlife refuges that aren't even owned really by the oil companies as much anymore. But when you do start messing around with those canals, the oil industry does start speaking up. They would prefer to keep access, unencumbered access to these areas, even if they're played out fields, because they're really hoping there'll be some new technology so they can go in and shoot some toxic chemical or something to get more oil out of them. So you'll see them move quickly when you start to talk about backfilling some of these areas, unfortunately.
Good evening. My name is Bob Anoni. I'm wondering, United Way does something with a thermometer and they fill it up during the course of the fundraising year. Could you put something online that we could monitor that shows this is what needs to be done for the plan, this is the timeline that it needs to be done by, here's the funding that needs to be available to do it? Are we losing? Are we gaining? Are we on schedule?
Yes,
Good idea.
we could.
NWF volunteered to do that.
National Wildlife Federation and
He said we'll
Two.
link to it.
Oh, are they going to answer? Okay. Two quick ones. For the 32, for my friends and relatives in the 32 states whose nutrient-rich dirt's going by and going over the continental shelf and creating a hypoxic zone, what do I say in my holiday cards to those people for them to say to their Congress people? The second question is a little more granular. I live in the lower 9. I'm only 1 foot, my house is 1 foot above base flood elevation. I'm between Claiborne and Florida. How many years do I have? Leaving storm surge out of the way, just in the course of current events.
I'll take the first one. Yeah, I think it's really important that we educate all of our friends and family outside of the Mississippi River Delta area about how important the nutrient runoff is. We've got sediment in the river, but we also have an awful lot of nitrogen and phosphorus and things that I argue, and I think scientifically we're not 100% sure, but likely makes our restoration challenge even greater. But certainly creates a dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico. So they should stop fertilizing their yards so much. But mostly they should be talking to their politicians about how are we incentivizing the large ag users to be as clean as possible and minimize runoff. And if they live in Chicago, they should make sure they clean up their sewage treatment plant too. It all adds up. There's a lot of different factors at work in creating the dead zone. But I do think that as much as Clint wants to write off politicians, I think, they are supposed to do the will of the people. That's why we create these governments, right? And that's why we elect politicians, to do the will of the people. So the will of the people needs to be more clearly asserted, certainly on issues like the dead zone.
let me add something to that. There really is a program of states, and there's been an effort to get states to change their ag practices. And one of the states that opposed those changes has been Louisiana.
Yeah, the Dead Zone Action Plan, Louisiana's not really embraced.
Comment about the base flood elevation. Those of you who are inside the perimeter of the levees have no idea how good you have it. Because the rest of the state, if the current plans on flood insurance proceed, are going to be in a far more desperate situation than they faced with the hurricanes. You are going to have a $200,000 house whose current flood insurance is like $800 a month, go to $28,000 a year. $800 a year to $28,000. And New Orleans, in a lot of New Orleans, the flood insurance is actually going down, but everywhere else in the coastal zone, it's about to put Louisiana out of business and make all of this moot.
We have another question back here, or up here. Well, she's got the mic, so. Sorry, well, she's coming. We got one mic. Go ahead.
Hey, my name is John Driscoll. Does anyone of the panelists, or does anyone in this room realize that the $50 billion plan is not a $50 billion plan.
You realize that?
And the reason it's not, I'm going to answer the
Because I met
question.
with him.
The reason it's not is because those cost estimates, which weren't really a budget's where you match revenues with expenditures over some period of time. That really wasn't done.
Right.
The master plan is a cost estimate.
Before the BP spill, I was sitting on the CPRA, looking at the out-year revenues, like $200 million or less, with the planned programs, approaching $1 billion, and that was just 2 to 3 years in the future. That's why I say without BP, we would be dead. We would be underwater. It's the only place the money was coming from.
Well, my point is that the cost estimate was done in 2010 dollars. So when you add inflation to that over 50 years, the total is 95 to 113 billion dollars. Double of what the $50 billion is supposed to be.
All right, next question.
Yes, I'm very impressed with the power of photographs. I think everyone in America has seen the photograph of Haiti and the Dominican Republic. The border, it's green on the Dominican Republic side, it's bare on the Haitian side because they cut all the trees down. I wonder why you're not publicizing a picture like that in the New Orleans airport. Every time all of us come through that airport, we see a picture of what is going on. That picture that you had on the computer the other night on the internet, very compelling.
Okay, here's
we
where
don't
you
see
can
it.
have your politicians.
You have
Wait
to
a second.
pay for them.
I have suggested that the city, which owns the airport, put a kiosk in there that's a mini museum. And I have written Andy Copeland and gotten no response. So there's something y'all can do. There's something y'all can do.
Bob wouldn't let me do a PowerPoint presentation.
My name is George Ricks. I'm president of the Save Louisiana Coalition, and I'd like to say we're in favor of the master plan, except for large-scale diversions. And I think John on the panel talked before about dollars and cents, and this gentleman said that Louisiana isn't about oil and gas. Louisiana is a fishing community, relies heavily on fishing. 1 out of every 70 jobs in the state of Louisiana is contributed to the commercial fishing industry. And seeing that the saltwater and commercial and recreational fishing industries in Louisiana provide an annual economic impact of well over $3 billion a year and provide nearly $300 million annually in state and local tax revenues and support over 35,000 jobs, why were there no studies done in the master plan on the financial impact these large-scale diversions will have on coastal communities they will detrimentally affect? And why were there no fishery studies done to determine the effects the massive amounts of fresh water from these diversions will have on the estuaries they will be impacted?
Question, answer? Someone here?
Well, I think the answer is that there were studies done and there were gaps that were identified in what needs to be done, and so those, as I said, the master plan process is an ongoing process, and all of those questions are continuing to be looked at and will continue to be looked at for the 2017 plan and the 2022 plan, et cetera, et cetera. But if you go through the hundreds of pages of appendices, you will find that virtually every question you can imagine was addressed to the extent of the science that was available and the information that was available at the time that they did the plan. We can all sit around and say we can't do anything until we know everything, and we can answer the question from Baton Rouge. But if we're going to save anything, we have to get moving.
Yeah, and point out, Clint Guidry said that he participated in those discussions and in meetings.
So he took his vote rights away and he left. You don't mind if I add that, do you?
No, I don't. I didn't know that. But I mean,
well, let me just say there were no votes. The framework development team didn't work on votes, And in fact, it was a sounding board for the CPRA and the consultants that were hired. We never took a vote on anything, so I don't know what that means.
I mean, there is a very complex process that was designed by the RAND Corporation, which frankly, that was trying to filter in input. I mean, these are all subjective values. They were trying to combine the cultural, the economic, with the technically feasible, trying to prioritize projects that created synergies. This is an extraordinarily complex system technically, and it goes back to what I said at the beginning, that the politics are maybe more complicated than the engineering. And I also said, you don't want to be in a situation of destroying the village to save it. I mean, but by the same token, some people are going to pay a very heavy price. And, you know, whoever doesn't get a chair to sit on is not going to be happy when the music stops. And it's going to get worse. It's not going to get better.
Bob Preskapikoff, I put on a water symposium. You participated some months ago, and a statement was brought up that I cannot get out of my mind. After listening to you saying that if we don't get, you used the word 70 billion, then New Orleans will be a levee-protected city, but a levee is good against storms, but not 360 days water.
Mud levee.
A mud levee just won't work. So I started thinking, well, do I really want to get a 30-year mortgage? And then someone came on and said that there's another solution, which is if you just run the river directly south so that the alluvial soil spills on high ground rather than falls off the continental cliff, we could do that. And I asked the price at $15 billion. I'm sure it's back of the napkin work. And I just thought to myself, if that's true, that's a sale that might be able to be made. You don't think you can get the 70 billion, whether it's from the oil companies or the federal government, or a combination of the two. But given the importance of New Orleans and all these things coming down, the transportation systems, we could make a sale like that. Does that have any legs, or is that was just a misstatement?
The channel realignment is actually, as I recall, reading the master plan, I'll let these guys talk about it, was considered the most efficient way for rebuilding land, just for that purpose. In other words, taking the main channel and punching it out into Barataria Bay or out into Black Bay. But they didn't know enough of it they didn't have the engineering done at the time or knew the cost. So they're still studying it, but it's not in this current plan. David?
Right. In fact, the master plan pledges some sum of money, I can't remember what it is, out of the 50 billion, the imaginary 50 billion, to in fact undertake that study. The issue there is that right now, in order to maintain deep draft navigation for the largest port system in the world, you have to use the power of the river to blast out at least some of the sediment that accumulates in Southwest Pass. We also have to spend $80 to $100 million a year dredging Southwest Pass. So it's not a very good system. It was a brilliant system when it was designed in 1879, and all they cared about was a 20-foot channel. But now we're to 45. With Panamax ships, they want to go to 50. This is a relatively primitive system. It uses rocks and wooden weirs to nozzle down the mouth of the river and to blast out a navigation channel with the force of the river. But you can't just abandon that system if you want to keep the port going. And it's the most important, in terms of bulk tonnage, it's the most important port in North America, from Baton Rouge to Plaquemines Parish. And so the issue is, how do you design a new system that allows efficient movement of ships in and out of the river, and then frees you to do a reroute on the shelf, higher up on the shelf in shallower water, where you have much higher retention. You know, when we talk, if we had dredges going that captured 100% of what they could capture from the bottom of the river, remember, there's a reason it's the Big Muddy. 80% of the sediment that is carried by the Mississippi River stays in suspension. You can't dredge it out without dredging out the water. So the dredges can only get 20%, the stuff on the bottom. That's good stuff. It's something we ought to go after. But if we want what's in the rest of the water column, we have to figure out a different way to capture it. And river rerouting would be the way, but we're a long way technically from understanding, not just technically, but also we're a long way from having the funds to be able to make that switch. But I think everyone recognizes that that's an extremely important goal,
Yeah, I mean,
including the navigation industry.
That's one of the areas that they're making significant progress on, I believe, in terms of how to design a diversion to maximize the amount of sediment they get out of it. In terms of what's actually going into deep water, it's only about 4% of the sediment goes out that channel, which is not insignificant. And I may have that number wrong, but I know it's under 10%, and I think well under. It's not insignificant, but it's not determinative.
But I just want to add to that. It's 10. That number is the number of what passes the old river control structure. So by the time you get all the way, but we have to be careful about thinking about that number. It's 100% of what makes it to Southwest Pass, right? We lose 100% of what makes it to Southwest Pass, and that's the problem. That's a tremendous amount of sediment.
Last question back here, then we're going to have some closing words from our editor-in-chief.
Carolyn Leftwich. David, you made an interesting statement, and one that I agree with, that coastal communities are going to have to make transitions. We cannot currently live the way we are living, given that there's global warming, seas are rising, the lands are sinking, and so forth. Given that, we are in New Orleans. Is there anyone at the city, at the planning table with the state, and making up any kind of resiliency planning, you know, when it comes to land use, when it comes to building structures and things like that? Is the city at the table, or they're still keeping their heads in the sand of denial?
Well, I will say that the city is at the table. The city is working with CPRA. The city is looking at these issues. I think we would all like to see more activity, more proactive engagement. I think, you know, just personally, we missed a huge opportunity. After Katrina, we basically bet everything on a new levee system. And what we got is 1 in 100 year protection. We didn't get a whole lot for $15 billion. And as John said, we are so much luckier than everyone else in coastal Louisiana. And we need to be enormously grateful to the American people for having given us that. We're not going to see it again. And therefore, we should be building out in the city to take into account that someday the water's going to come over the top of those levees.
We could literally go on for hours and hours. In fact, we're not finished yet.
Let me explain what the 100-year protection means. Okay.
We're going all around the room.
Well,
It is, because we're out of time.
Keep talking ad infinitum.
You can talk to people.
Okay, 1% chance of a storm hitting in any given year. That's what the protection means. But if you add up year after year, in an 18-year period, you've got a 1 in 6 chance that a storm greater than the protection system hits. That is playing Russian roulette. If you've got a kid born today and he turns 18, he plays Russian roulette. That's your chances. Over a 100-year period, you have a better than almost a two-thirds chance that you will have a storm greater than the protection system. In the last 86 years on the river, there have been 4 floods in this area that have exceeded the 100-year standard. The river levees are built to a much, much higher standard. So the 100-year protection is absolute minimal. Do not feel secure behind that.
Well, we could go on forever. We almost did. but we're out of time. I think our panelists will be here for a little bit longer, maybe, having some refreshments. If you'd like to approach them and ask them some questions, that would be great. Before you leave, I'd like to have a few words, I'd like you to hear a few words from our editor, Steve Beattie.
Thanks. And thanks, Bob. What a great job that Bob did tonight. I hope many of you had a chance to hear Bob's series on WWNO that ran last week. I understand they're trying to put it together as a podcast, so if you've missed it, there'll be a chance to come back and give another listen. Again, thank you to all our panelists, too. What a fabulous group of people that gave their time tonight. As we said, one of the goals of the Lens is to write about stories that nobody else is doing, but it's also to engage the public, to have events just like this. We think this is a different form of journalism, a different way to talk with the community and have the community talk back with us, though maybe not as much time as we all would like to have. But I appreciate everyone coming here tonight. Please enjoy what's left of the refreshments out there, and if people would like to come up and have a word with us. The Lens staff is here, all 11 of us. We've got these snazzy name tags on, so you can't miss us here. And again, thank you very much. It's I wish I could say it was just an uplifting night full of enthusiasm, but you know, I don't know about Mr. Kabikoff, but my 30-year mortgage, I might have to refinance down to 15. Again, thanks very much, and a round of applause for the panelists. Thank you very much.